So we have finally come to the last presentation. It's the presentation of the organizer of this workshop. That is Professor Carlo Chiurco. Carlo Chiurco is an associate professor of moral philosophy at the University of Verona. And his presentation, the title of his presentation is From Will to Autonomy to Automatism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will try to be, I must run, baby, run. So we're living exciting yet extremely confusing times. Autonomy of will, the quintessentially modern, Western, and liberal paradigm, is both exploding and imploding, being subject to tide forces that are tearing it apart by pulling in opposite directions. On the one hand, autonomy is exploding because the radical torsion undergone by autonomy in the last decades in terms of freedom of choice, self-determination, emancipation, empowerment, has established an increasingly unrelated, entirely self-referential conception of subjectivity, which I will call here the sovereign subjectivity, or I prefer the raw autonomy model. This model influences both mainstream society and the politically radicalized minorities who love to think of themselves as antagonist avant-garde. In mainstream society, we see many forms of fragmented freedom of choice, such as voluntary childlessness, voluntary singleness, voluntary resignation, and so on. These phenomena are increasingly undermining the basic functioning of our society, involve hundreds of millions of people, especially the cosmopolite young urbanites who populated the network of global cities around the world, where social and cultural trends are decided. And they are a mix of resignation and perfectly individual choice. Coming to radicalized minorities, such as, for instance, transfeminism, LGBTQ plus activism, eco-activism, woke, and cancel culture, especially, raw autonomy takes the shape of self-determination, emancipation, empowerment, experienced in purely politicized and somewhat psychedelic terms. I am not what I am, but what I feel I am. For instance, trans identity has moved from a medicalized conception, I am a trans person because I underwent psychological counseling and surgical interventions, to a purely politicized one. I am a trans person because I feel so. Or also think of the extreme autonomy modeling in the bioethics of Tristram Engelhard, for instance, where the autonomy of the patient is so strong that the physician must beg permission to him in order to cure him. So in all these cases, the notion of sovereign subjectivity is key. Unlike Kant's autonomy, raw autonomy is not placed under the strict surveillance of reason, because any surveillance, even by reason, is rejected as imperialistic and indeed heteronomous, because reason is not neutral anymore, but implies all sorts of hidden power and control dynamics, patriarchy, medicalization, paternalism, Eurocentrism, logocentrism, and so on. However, the core idea of autonomy as the subjectivity's capacity to be law to itself persists in the rejection of the core idea of heteronomy, namely the attraction exerted by any possible external force or object. For instance, in medically assisted suicide, I do not choose it because I follow purely rational norms I shape to be law upon myself, but neither do I choose it because I feel attracted by suicide. This is crystal clean from all the farewell notes left by those who make this choice. I choose it simply because this is my choice. I choose so. In this respect, then, Kant has truly enacted the Copernican revolution, as he claimed he did, because we all embrace autonomy as the paradigm of choice. In this sense, therefore, autonomy is exploding. It multiplies unchecked in countless varieties. We are seemingly living the age of the triumph of autonomy. Yet, on the other hand, autonomy seems to be imploding. The world is experiencing a rampant rise in autocratic rule. Freedom, the base of autonomy, is despised. Might is right. At a deeper civilizational level, the unstoppable rise of AI has accelerated the trend of humans giving their agency and autonomy up to machines. Students do not write papers anymore because large language models are way better than that, and the academics could just follow suit. Ophthalmologists or radiologists are already quickly deskilling because not even the best among them can match the ability of AI models of diagnostics by imaging. AI models and social media before them have turned us into passive users, thrown us into the epistemic chaos of fake news and conspiracy theories, and undermined and steered our agency at the ballot box. Algorithms, trolls, and bots have finally vindicated the old inquisitor of the brothers Karamazov. People now have a good reason to refuse the burden of freedom. They have machines to carry it for them. Even warfare is now managed by, and not simply through, automated systems. Drones and missiles are making soldiers increasingly useless, and destruction is done from remote. So even this most human and most among human activities, war, is given up to machines. Autonomy seems to implode into automatism in its sad twilight. At the same time, when it seems to explode in unrestrained varieties in its age of in the age of its triumph. Sorry, I forgot the first slide. So we move to the second section, autonomy and as automatism. So autonomy is clearly facing an existential contradiction. In earnest, many scholars are convinced of an all-out opposition between autonomy and automatism. Okay, automatism comes from the ancient Greek verb automatizo, which means to act of oneself, act often or unadvisedly, to be done spontaneously or at random, haphazard, to introduce the agency of chance, of things, to happen of themselves casually, to be self-produced, and of natural agencies, to act spontaneously. The adjective automatismos means that which happens of itself, chance, and the noun automaton, which is also used by Kant, means accident. Moreover, Automatia is the goddess of chance, a surname of Tyche or Fortuna, which seems to characterize her as the goddess who manages things according to her own will, without any regard to the merit of men. So, according to Kant, we have a Kant robot. We have an automaton materiale when the machine is driven by matter, and an automaton spirituale when it is driven by representations. In the latter case, the word automaton can be ascribed to humans too. If the freedom of our will were none other than the latter, say psychological and comparative, but not also transcendental, that is absolute, then it would at bottom be nothing better than the freedom of a turnspit, which, when once it is wound up, also accomplishes its movements of itself. Therefore, automatism and autonomy seem to be opposites, the former expressing the heteronomy of what is contingent, haphazard, offhand, unadvised, spontaneous, random, casual, accidental, and so on, the latter expressing the opposite, the autonomy of reason. All moral concepts that have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason, and indeed in the most common reason, just as in reason that is speculative in the highest degree, they cannot be abstracted from any empirical and therefore merely contingent cognition. I don't agree with this reading. So this reading that places autonomy and automatism as completely opposite for two reasons. Okay. Firstly, machines may also foster people's empowerment. For instance, when photography, cinema, and even the humbler applied art of advertising billboard experienced a rapid mass diffusion at the end of 19th, beginning of 20th century, they played a significant role in shaping a new and independent female identity. Nietzsche had already understood that just as our thought shapes machines, so they shape our thoughts in turn when we use them. Our writing tools are also working on our thoughts. Secondly, This fear of the machine is nothing new. Already in 1963, Gunther Anders had masterfully described the human feeling of impotence faced to machine power, Kraft, pushing humans not only to give their agency up, but even let the machine become their paragon. Humans long for the machine's velocity, precision, capacity to store and increasingly elaborate data, tirelessness, immunity to illness, even immortality, in a relation Anders called the Promethean gap. True, however, such gap is real. To criticize humans' self-dispossession of their autonomy in favor of automatism, both in terms of making machines more autonomous and steadily making humans behave in an increasingly automated way, without recognizing the existence of this gap, because machines do surpass us in many tasks, risks to be another pointless exercise in the trite rhetoric of human values. Therefore, how to solve the contradiction of autonomy, at the same time exploding and imploding, and what to do with autonomy and automatism? So, now we move to the paradigm of will. So the Greek model of will and then the Christian model of will. Autonomy is a modern invention, the modern paradigm of human capacity to choose, but neither the only nor the first one found in Western philosophical reflection. Indeed, the first one was will, which I considered an essentially Greek Christian invention. My main contention is that, unlike autonomy, will was built, one, having in mind a notion of power as Macht, not Kraft. Two, was focused on an ample vision of the greatness of the human. And three, actively pursues an increase in human power in terms of human self-overcoming. The will paradigm is also focused on empowering humanity with the capacity to open the very possibility of many possible futures, a veritable open sea of possibilities, to quote Nietzsche in one of the most famous sections of gay science, an open sea of possibilities that makes the world becoming infinite for us all over again. While the range of action of will's power, Macht, potentially spans over the entire world, sovereign subjectivity is a never-retreating hegemon that slowly but steadily ends up entrenching itself in the individual and irrelated body. Thus, the modern autonomy paradigm appears to be a retreat of the human, a process Nietzsche denounces as the shrinking of humankind. Alarmingly, this happens at a time when, thanks to techniques, power in terms of craft is spiking at unprecedented levels. This makes autonomy essentially weaker and forces it to compete on a semantic ground, precisely that of craft, where machines enjoy a structural competitive advantage. After showing the difference between the two paradigms, I will consequently move to the conclusion, trying to draft what lessons can be drawn from will and how we can possibly solve the present contradiction of autonomy. So even if I consider will an essentially Greek Christian invention, I do not deny, of course, neither that it was Augustine who first exposed the first clear thematization of the quintessentially legal notion of responsibility. We read the quotation from by Nietzsche before, nor the obvious role played by exquisitely Christian notions such as sin, guilt, and salvation that were, of course, completely alien to the Greek spirit. After all, Augustine was a lawyer by training, as well as the inventor of the theological notion of original sin. This said, I am still convinced that there are also deep elements of continuity between the ancients and the Christians. In Christianism, mainly the focus on greatness and future. So, to approach the Greek notion of heroic will, I have chosen a very famous text, the first Stasimon of Sophocles' Antigones, which I like to see it as a sort of ancient Greek manifesto of will to power. Okay, we all know the text, of course. It begins with a declaration concerning the nature of man. Man is deinon. Many things are astonishing, but nothing lives that is more bewildering marvel, deinon, than man. The following lines seek to demonstrate this opening, this grand opening, okay? So this text also comes very handy for my purpose because it displays an incredibly positive notion of techniques. Greeks were not afraid of techniques and were not afraid to employ it powerfully and steadily, but techniques here is clearly seen as an essential characteristic of humanity bound to enhance its power. Here, math guides craft, not vice versa. So humans have found remedies for incurable diseases and have dominated the elements, water, earth, and air. With their ingenuity, perifrades aner, they hunt all living beings on sea, earth, and air. They learned the wind-like thought, anemone phronema, and sociality. And the conclusion, rich in resources and never without resources. He faces all future events. From hates only, he will not escape. Also, he found remedies for incurable diseases. By possessing, beyond all hope, the ingenuity of techniques, sometimes he moves towards evil, sometimes towards good, if he respects the laws of earth, etc. So the text shows will as humanity's heroic projection over itself. Humans may be mortal, but they are no less strong-willed than heroes and demigods by means of their intellectual and moral capacities, which make up for their non-divine origin, such as ingenuity, their capacity to think, and their technical skills. Human virtue is dynamis, a capacity to develop. However, this list of remarkable achievements is by no means complete. They look more like chapters of a very lustrous histories whose end is still not in sight. Will here amounts to openness to the world and the future, and displays an idea of humanity that reminds us of courageous seafaring into uncharted waters. Such fondness for openness, such a disposition toward future, is also mirrored in many Greek expressions concerning will. For instance, hekon and akon, which mean willingly and unwillingly. They are mobile meanings. For instance, the expression phonous accusius, literally unwilling homicide, may mean guilt is completely absent here, negligence, carelessness. This is an homicide committed in a more or less temporary momentum, or committed for legitimate self-defense. What we have here is not a clear indictment, but a constellation of meaning. So this openness, which is a characteristic of the Greek language itself, is mirrored everywhere in Greek thought. Also in the so-called Greek metaphysical thinking, and of course we have the example of Platonic dialogues. They constantly revert to the same problem, every time finding a different solution to the same problem. But also, the heroic idea of will as openness and human self-overcoming is also found both in Plato and Aristotle. Risk is beautiful. Kalos garhokindiunos, says Plato in the Phaedon. And Aristotle's virtue, too often confused with mediocrity, is an exercise in self-projection too, as the case of courage clearly shows. Finally, heroism is part of virtue too, as the capacity to endure many and big misfortunes characterizes the wise person. However, I quote Aristotle, even in such cases, the moral good shines whenever someone is capable to endure many and big misfortunes with a calm soul, not out of apathy, but because he is noble and dignified. So even Aristotle's rational, almost academic, mature philosophical production still shows the same characteristics of openness to the future and heroic self-projection as found in tragedy. And now we move to Christian. Maybe I could cut this short, unfortunately, as in academic teaching programs, medieval thinking is always cut off. So, no, I will try to go to the gist. Okay. So the first interesting thing is that Augustine. I'm talking of the Liber Arbitrio, of course. In the Liber Arbitrio, Augustine highlights the element of firmitas. Okay, firmitas. He says we must use reason not as Plato does in open terms. We must over and over revert to the same problem. No, here we must something, a truth, to hold, say Augustine, in the firmest possible way, tenere firmissimum. So this element of firmitas, which means both firmness and solidity, is also found in Augustine's definition of will. So it is interesting here because an essential characteristic of will for Augustine is its capacity to hold something up, to not let it go. Letting go becomes not a sign of wisdom, as in East Asian culture, for instance, but exactly the opposite. Letting go is the mark of shallowness of someone who either desires too much or does not know how to desire properly, for instance, by not choosing the right things to desire. So this negative capacity of losing things is a passion. Augustine calls it cupiditas, immoderate desire, and is a force underlying all evil actions. Secondly, when inventing the notion of responsible will, the lower Augustine employs a judiciary terminology introducing the notion of culpa, fault, guilt, and binding it with cupiditas, moderate desire. Thus, we obtain culpabilis cupiditas or libido, which is the root of evil will. Guilty, immoderate desire, lust, libido, is the love of those things that one can lose even unwittingly. So after having defined the nature of bad will, Augustine moves to define good will. Humans possess two capacities. The first is freedom, which is the condition allowing them to choose, and will, the force determining any choice. So good will is the will to desire to live according to justice and honesty and reach supreme knowledge. In the eyes of those willing to live a good life, riches, power, and bodily pleasures are worth nothing, because these are things that one can lose even unwittingly. But to lose our good will depends solely on our will. Okay? We can lose it only if we want to. Indeed, what is more present in our will than our will itself? Conversely, in order to have a good will, we only need to will it. Or, as Augustine puts it, to love our goodwill. The happy man loves his goodwill. And the interesting thing is that we don't need knowledge to do so. Will is all we need. Why should we doubt that we deserve to live a life happy and worthy of praise, even if we were not wise, or to live a miserable and happy one through our will alone? So will is completely unconditional. So there are unquestionable differences between the Greek and the Christian paradigms of will. For the Greeks, will shows heroic traits. For Augustine, it is unconditional. For the Greeks, will underlies humanity's heroic destiny, while Augustine's almost militarized notion of strong and unconditional will advocates a vision of human life as a battlefield. Still, some essential invariances linger on. Both paradigms know and valorize openness to the future, and it would be a mistake to think that both paradigms are heroic, first. And second, they also valorize openness to the future. It would be a mistake to think that this element, the element of openness to the future, in Christianism, is found only as the expectation of a possible salvation to come. Just think of how medieval men gladly engaged in incredible constructions, being perfectly aware neither they, not even their grandsons, would never be able to see them completed. Despite what Nietzsche says about Christianism, this is precisely an example of that capacity to create future, to have time ahead of oneself, he appreciated so much. And traditionally, he referred this capacity to have time ahead of oneself to Rome, the Roman Empire. Therefore, heroic self-projection as an obligation to human greatness survives in both paradigms, which are variations on the same theme of will as the cultural transfiguration of humanity's capacity to endure into a sort of transcendence. For the Greeks, it is the bewildering wonder, the thauma of human exceptionality in the cosmos that confers immortality to humans. In Augustine's militant Christianism, transfiguration in culture becomes the strength to pursue a conversion from time to eternity, from transient and slippery goods to something we can hold on to forever, a movement Augustine calls convertere ad aeterna. So, will face to autonomy. So, when comparing the two paradigms, will and autonomy, the ancient medieval one and the modern one, the only shared element is legal terminology, which in Kant becomes even stronger and more binding. Indeed, we witness a shift from Augustine's model of responsibility as culpability to Kant's model revolving around imputation, which adds punishment, which is not present in Augustine, which adds punishment to the very definition of autonomy. All the medievals always thinking of sin. No, you don't find punishment in Augustine. Autonomy for Kant is a kind of freedom that implies morality, but morality can only be understood in terms of imputation. That is the condition of being, I quote, culpable and deserving of punishment. However, the autonomy paradigm is silent on human self-projecting or self-overcoming, nor seems to favor any openness. On the contrary, the individual completely retreats into himself. Kant's famous image accompanying his moral reflection, the starry heavens above, moral law within, does not display a relation or even a convergence between humans and the sky, like the medieval analogy between microcosm and macrocosm, the Hermetic tabula smaragdina did, as above, so below. It excludes it. There's no point for me to look up to the sky, the law of nature. All I need is to focus on my fully natural, rational interiority. Therefore, the paradigm of modern autonomy does not simply lack the fundamental features of the paradigm of ancient will, it is rather built in opposition to them. To quote one of Nietzsche's most interesting distinctions in Twilight of the Idols, the modern paradigm of autonomy of the will belongs to those morals whose scope is to tame humans, as opposed to those morals who strive to breed new and possibly superior kinds of humans. Not incidentally, then, will in Kant, unlike in Augustine, is not unconditional, but placed under the strict surveillance of reason. Such a move is completely foreign to the mentality of the ancient and medieval man, who invariably favors a cooperation between, or a combination of, human faculties, where reason, if anything, plays a coordination role, but it's never sovereign. This is not incidental. You don't need unconditional will, let alone will to power, if your idea of humanity excludes the pursuing of self-projection as its innermost Streben. Autonomous subjectivity is content to impose its power on the individual and unrelated body, as gender and end-of-life activism testify. But while the age of autonomy has experienced a continuous shrinking of human faculty of choice in terms of Macht, it has also witnessed the most stupendous and awe-inspiring expansion of power in terms of craft. Not coincidentally, machine's craft could expand only in a situation where human Macht was bowing out and exiting. Therefore, it seems to me that autonomy and automatism are less reciprocally excluding than reciprocally co-implicating. Unlike Kant's hopes in what is enlightenment, autonomy seems to have ended up marking less the coming of age of humankind than the rising age of craft unleashed. I say unleashed because the power of techniques is not absent in Sophocles, just as it was well known to the many generations frantically working in the Middle Ages to cover Europe with a splendid cloak of cathedrals. But then craft was effectively instrumental to Macht, to human self-transfiguration and self-projection in time to reach out for eternity. Having silenced this capacity, only craft remains. However, craft is a semantic horizon much more suited to machines than humans. There is no competition here. Machines have the upper hand. By accepting craft as the universal semantic equivalent and paragon against which any other meaning is assessed, humankind abdicates and shrinks. Enacting that condition, Nietzsche dramatically denounces in one of his last notes, the machinization of humankind Marginalisierung der Menschheit, followed by the now inevitable general economic administration of the earth and the ever-increasing economic consumption of humans and humankind. All this leads to a shrinking of humankind, a sort of freezing of the level of humankind. To summarize it all in the words of a key distinction in German intellectual history, will speaks the language of culture, Kultur. Autonomy, the language of civilization, Zivilisation. The former leads to the extension of humankind, the latter to its near definitive, who knows, taming. Conclusion, agency within the limits of mortality alone. The implosion of autonomy we are experiencing is no little thing. It's the demise of an entire world, our world. We owe autonomy voting rights, workers' rights, women's rights, gay rights, disabled people rights. It helps depathologizing illness or social conditions forcibly disguised as illness, homosexuality, for once. All these advantages risk to be clearly affected, may be lost. Nor, because autonomy is shrinking, nor the revolts against autonomy and modernity brought about by German culture, such as Nietzsche's dream to restore tragedy at the center of European culture against European civilization built on modern values, are reasonably viable. So the option of, okay, so let's get rid of autonomy, let's restore will, these options are not viable. You cannot restore tragedy, as Nietzsche experienced on his own scale. Therefore, what can we do? How reconcile the language of culture, will, and the language of civilization, autonomy? Because clearly, we can do without autonomy. The framework I propose here is simple. If we could indeed insert a truly cultural element within our essentially civilizational paradigm, we would strengthen autonomy by reactivating human Macht, the only power that can structurally face the craft of techniques. And maybe we would be capable to experience openness to the future again. The secret behind Greek and medieval will to power, leading to the existence of all those great examples of the past we admire so much, was awareness of our mortality. Sophocles is adamant. Human will to power, capable to reach spectacular achievements, is precisely powered by mortality. Human finitude, represented here by the unavoidability of death, its ultimate marker, is seen not as a limit, but as the main driver of human change. It does not close the future, it opens its very possibility. It is precisely because of the awareness of our mortality, not despite it, that we are a bewildering wonder. The lesson from Greek and Christian notion of will, then, shows a model where perfection is ruled out and perfectibility is not indefinite, exactly the opposite of our world, where raw autonomy is allied with techniques' unquenchable appetite for ever more craft, ever more perfectibility. For us, perfectibility is indefinite, and perfection comes as unlimited performativity, triggering our escape into the realms of cyber post-humanity or transhumanity. This awareness of our finitude has precious lessons for today's world because it convincingly fends off the claim that acceptance of reality, symbolized by its most daunting limitation, death, comes at the cost of severely hindering our possibilities. On the contrary, it saves possibilities from being mere illusions and reinstates them in their true nature of life projects, enabling people becoming who they are and not simply who they want to be. Ok. Giorgione la vecchia, of course. So I think we have 5 minutes for the discussion, but I don't want to be the moderator of myself, the supervisor of myself. So no, I leave Giorgione. Sorry, it's so beautiful. No, she's not beautiful. Beautiful as a matter of fact. She's not beautiful at all, but moderately moderato.
So, are there any questions?
Yeah, so not really a question so much as a comment, or two comments. One is that the simple one is that I think your diagnosis of contemporary balance between hyper-autonomy and the constraint of autonomy, that we're sort of autonomously walking ourselves into state of non-autonomy, we are willlessness in a very strange way, is an incredibly brilliant diagnosis. That's one comment. The second comment is, I think you're one of the best speakers I've ever heard. And I don't mean of Italian people speaking in English. I mean just in English, period. That was brilliant. I thought the rhetoric, the delivery was inspired. It was incredible. So I don't have a question. I think you're just brilliant. I just think that was brilliant. So that's it. That's all I've got to say.
Of course, I'm perfectly aware that I force definitions and concepts, of course, but for the sake of my provocation, of course, it is. I know that, for instance, Augustine distinguishes, I know very well that Augustine distinguishes will and liberum arbitrium. Voluntas is not liberum arbitrium. There are several degrees of will. So I'm well aware that I force somehow so many notions also. But I was really moved by the contradiction that we are experiencing, because, for instance, in the scholarly literature about AI, you see very much this paradigm. Okay, autonomy is not automatism. Okay, they say I can understand that, of course. Yet what we are experiencing is precisely this contradiction. The contradiction between the explosion of autonomy, of this radicalized version of hyper-autonomy on the one hand, yet on the other, the constant invasion, of automation. Humans becoming more automated, machines becoming more autonomous. There's a very good article by Simona Chiodo that tries to, and she concludes and says, why machines are becoming more autonomous? Because simply we want to relinquish our responsibility. I'm not convinced of that. It would be nice if this were just the reason. I am afraid there is something worse at work at a deeper level here. So, and this is basically what I try to highlight.
Could we understand this in the terms of Nietzsche's image of the last man?
Oh, yes. Yes, precisely, because another interesting thing is that these sort of hyper-autonomous individualities would basically, I am what I want to be, I am what I want, okay? This kind of hyper-autonomy shares many characteristics with Nietzsche's last man, because we see that hyper-autonomy actually is accompanied by a shrinking in human agency. A shrinking of human agency. Since I self-determine myself so strongly, so to the extent that I basically renounce defining myself. Defining myself is not important anymore, okay? I even renounce to this, okay? Why? Because it could be seen as another constraint of my hyper-autonomy, right? Yet, on the other hand, we see that the human agency is constantly shrinking into a sort of non-violence, which is basically renouncing to acting. And I'm not criticizing non-violence here or pacifism or something like that. I simply see that, especially in Nietzschean terms, all this basically, this hyper-autonomy, and this is why, for me, for instance, Simona Chiodi is wrong when she says we delegate our autonomy to machines. Okay, no, it's not true, because we see that this delegation of our responsibility comes precisely in these forms of hyper-autonomy. I am not responsible of anything, basically. That's the point. Especially, I mean, if you are into gender activism, as I am, for obvious reasons, and you clearly see these patterns. You clearly see these patterns, and it's a renounce. This renounce to define, and also this will to actually. To scrape definition altogether, because on the one hand, because it's a limitation, okay, because it's a violence imposed and so on. Yet on the other hand, beside this first, even violence, somehow also very violent act, you see that there is a clear demise of responsibility. Because responsibility means too much, and again, it comes as a constraint to my hyper-autonomy. So I think that this link between autonomy and automatism actually is not an opposition, but there is something within autonomy that from the very beginning, okay, made automatism possible as the shrinking of autonomy.
Yeah, sure.
I've heard before when you were making the distinction between Zivilisation und Kultur. This is, of course, Thomas Mann, die Betrachtungen eines vom Politischen, where you have this opposition between NAFTA, the Jesuit, and Settembrini, which is the Aufklärung, so the Enlightenment. I would say, of course, the wheel is on the side of NAFTA, and let's say, what is on the side of Settembrini? We could also say representation, if you want. So that the big struggle here is either we take the modernity as a point where subjectivism, which is based on the cogito, and at the end, cogito, representation, and subjectivism are one and the same line. And of course, you reach a point where you can say, I am who I want, in a way, because I am the way in which I do represent myself. So if I feel that I want to represent myself as a plant, you have to address me as a plant, but in vegetable terms. But the other way around, going with the wheel as something which is able to vertically go beyond this modernity of representation and to reach something more fundamental, that's very risky, because that can go back to all what we know. I mean, even historically speaking, Bluetooth Boden, if you want, that's the risk. So I would like to know, do we have to buy this sometimes ridiculous form of hyper-subjectivistic representation, which is the tendency of a certain kind of modern world? Or do we have to go to a direction which is very risky at the level of at the political level? What is the in-between? What is the way to get out between one? Because I don't like neither nor. Let's say neither the one nor the other. I would like to think of the other option, not in terms of will, but because of the will would be still the lion, going back to the metamorphosis. I say no, and I have a will to power I can exert. You could use the other way around against the representation, but in terms of a child, for example, and that would be a completely different story, though.
So I would say first, I don't think that gluten is a sort of has anything to do with will. It's nothing willing at work here because we lack humanity's self-projection. I mean, we lack the heroic, all these characteristics you can find, for instance, in Sophocles, you know. The reason aesthetic, the only thing I can find in that sort of representation is Colosso Indianos, but in a very aestheticized way. It's about death, precisely. But we have to accept that, not to look for it, you know, because we are just like in the fascist orgy of Salò, le 120 giornate. We want. I don't know. Where is the self-projection here? Where is human self-projection here? Human self-projection over itself. I don't find it. I would say that it is another chapter, okay, of the history of modern subjectivity. And I think here that the most important character here is, of course, I couldn't stress it as I should have done, is relation. The real problem is when I defined the sovereign subjectivity or raw autonomy, the unrelated, that is the key. The absence of relation. That's the point. The problems, all the problems with modern subjectivity, from the hyper representation in totalitarian terms of Glutenboden to this hyper autonomous form of self-representation, as for instance in woke activism, they all come as original forms of denial of relation. That's the point. And indeed, especially in bioethics, there are many concepts of autonomy. And for instance, feminist ethics has desperately tried to save autonomy by correcting it. Indeed, we talk of relational autonomy, which is probably the best paradigm. Also, from the medical point of view, from the point of view of medical humanities, the problem I see here that in any case, these are forms of ethics that still move from self-awareness. Then I become aware that I cannot be completely alone, so I somehow must transcend myself. The point here, what I see here, the problems of all these conceptions, for instance, okay, no, I cut it short. The problem I see with all these conceptions is that you still move from yourself. So how can you possibly transcend yourself? So either relation is original, ursprünglich, either relation is original. We are originally conceived as a polarity of relations, okay, of a net of relations, okay. Otherwise, this self-transcendence of a self that becomes aware, oh my God, I am an unrelated self. I must self-transcend, you know. No, it is not really possible because the hypothesis of origin, the original hypothesis, is wrong, is already unrelated. If you conceive the self as originally unrelated, then you can strive, of course, okay, to perform this self-transcendence, but in the end, there's always the ghost of the cogito haunting you. The only possibility is to think of relation as original, of reality as a network of relations. Even better, but... Stato grandissimo piacere. Ciao, buon viaggio.
Just one thing, if I may. I think I pretty much agree with you on this assessment on, let's say, a Nazist death cult, because in this death cult, actually, there is no experience of finitude.
Of course. Exactly.
There is no experience of finitude. So I think that's the turning point, because that's where the self-overcoming comes into play.
It's important is that this experience of finitude is a shared one. It's the only thing that we truly share. We all must die. We are all mortals. So it is a shared experience. Of course, my death is my death, but it's a shared experience. Because, for instance, now it's very fashionable to speak of vulnerability, okay? Very nice, but still I found vulnerability too much an abstract notion, whereas mortality is not abstract. Sorry, guys, no, it cannot be abstract at all, okay? So it is the only thing. So finiteness becomes a shared notion, and this is why the Greeks, the Romans, the medievals were also great cultures, not simply great civilizations. There was also, they had incredibly great spirits, but at the end, cathedrals are a collective work. Even if there is the Parthenon, is a collective work. If there's a genius that draw them, design them, whatever, but still it is a collective work. Even Giorgione, because this painting was made in atelier. It's never an artist alone who painted these artworks. There's always many hands, and also this ability to share, this knowledge, this. No, I think that this is also the only possible, since another problem, of course, we are facing is the complete dissolution of community, which is a terrible problem. The only possible thing, I still have to finish to answer to Marcello. So yes, will, I don't want to recover will as such. I just want to recover this particular aspect of the past world of will, okay? That is the awareness of our mortality. Because in the end, that was the engine. Also, all the other elements, all the other features do not belong to us anymore. It's like Nietzsche claiming, oh, I want to reinstate tragedy again. No, it's not possible. Not Greeks anymore. You are a German son of a Protestant pastor. Come on. Get real. So, but this thing, awareness of mortality, is really transcending times. It is something these ancient Greeks or medieval shared and possessed, but it is also something that we possess, okay? And of course, we try to erase it in all possible way. So, I think that they are good things. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, really, Carlo, for everything. For your presentation.